Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the War Room, which is our interview series as part of the Clone Star Pod. I am your host, Seán Ferrick, and joining me is the wonderful author of such books as A Dangerous Trade and Escape Route, both of which are based around Star Trek Prodigy, and of course, Shadows Have Offended, which is a TNG tie-in novel as well. But there is not just Star Trek, there is also Halo, and there is, of course, original works as well. This author is a master teaching us how to create villains, fan fiction, into original fiction, wonderful erotica, and, of course, teaching us how to create tension as well. She has been nominated for numerous awards, including the Philip K. Dick Award, and I am very, very pleased to welcome Cassandra Clarke here today. How are you today?
I am good. Happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Delighted to have you here. It is. What's it like where you are in the world right now? Is it a nice day? Is it a bright day? A wet day?
Summer. I'm not a big summer person. I don't like the heat, but it's pretty nice. As far as summer goes, 80s, or I'm not sure what that is in Celsius.
I think I know enough about Fahrenheit to know, like, that's a nice day.
Yeah, yeah, not too hot, not too cold.
That is great. I was actually, funny enough, I was talking to a friend of mine eurlier who's just back from Australia, and I said, "How was Australia?" And he said, "Cold." And I went, "I've never read that sentence before." Yeah, climate change, folks, it's happening. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about all things you.
Wow, that feels like a lot of pressure, but okay.
It's grand. No pressure at all. No pressure at all. Just need to, things, your blood type, kind of a list of your fears, the usual. No, we wanted to reach out and speak to you because, obviously, like we're obviously mainly a Star Trek based podcast, but we are, all types of media, all very, very welcome. And because I know one of my co-hosts is screaming, ask about the Halo books. But what caught my eye straight away is everything right now for me is so Star Trek Prodigy, Star Trek Prodigy, Star Trek Prodigy. So my first question is to you: how has it been creating these additional stories in what has become, I think, one of the most discussed and difficult to watch Star Treks at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it was really fun. They reached out to me and just asked, "Hey, do you want to write in Star Trek Prodigy?" And this was actually before I think the show had been officially announced. This was a few years ago. So I was like, "Oh wow, they're doing a kids show, and I get to write in it." That was like super exciting. So yeah, it's really fun. I find Star Trek Prodigy just like super charming. Like the show is just like incredibly charming, and it feels very sort of Star Trekky, like kind of that sense of wonder that is, such a big part of Star Trek. And I feel like it captures that really well because it is, for younger audiences. So that was really fun to get to play around with. And this is also my first book for what's called middle grade in the publishing world, basically kind of 8 to 12-year-olds. So it was fun to kind of try to capture that voice and to think like, what's going to appeal to kids? Because what they want from a book is not necessarily what an adult wants, right? So kind of trying to capture that voice, but still make it feel like Star Trek, right? So something that would appeal to young readers who maybe haven't seen every single episode of Star Trek 30 times, which I feel is a lot of the people reading the the tie-in novels for the other shows. But that would also like capture that sense of Star Trek and make them love Star Trek and want to go back and maybe watch those shows either now or when they're a little older. So it was kind of just like a fun challenge, I guess.
And we've been fortunate enough that we've spoken to a few authors who have worked in tie-in media as well, and everyone has sort of similar stories and then wildly differing stories as well. So you've worked with the Prodigy team, and of course you've also written a Next Generation tie-in novel as well. Were the processes, were they quite different, or were they very similar in that TNG obviously has now been off the air for a couple of years? That's the way I'm going to describe that. And Prodigy, of course, is quite current.
Yeah, the processes were actually really different, which was, I guess, not that surprising, because, like you said, one has been off the air for years, and the other was when I was writing them, it hadn't even aired yet. I actually got sneak or supposed to get sneak preview episodes, and then I didn't, but I did get the scripts ahead of time, so I was actually able to read the scripts of the first 10 episodes before the show had aired, so it made me feel cool. Like, oh wow, I got knowledge. But yeah, so I'm just like, with TNG, they basically said, write whatever you want, right? You here's your story, you decide a story, you pitch some story ideas, we'll pick the one we like the best, which was actually much harder than you might think. That was really challenging. There's a lot of pressure with TNG because it's so beloved, and trying to come up with a story that fits that world and its vibe was like, wow, it's a lot of pressure. So that was kind of how the TNG went. It was like, I pitched an idea, and then I worked with them and on the canon and all of that. With Prodigy, they actually gave me the outline, right? So they like basically said, this is the story we want you to tell, which I kind of liked a little bit better. It took some of the pressure off. But it was kind of cool because it meant I got to write sort of an intermediary stories between the two seasons or release. I'm not sure if they're really seasons or releases, however they're framing that. Where, after the first 10 episodes, my books kind of take place in between that. Or my first one does, and then the second one kind of takes place after the next set of episodes. So it was kind of cool to sort of serve as a bridge and to be sort of like, oh, this is one of their secret little adventures. So it felt like it was more tied into the show than TNG did. Because the TNG book was just, it was technically took place, I think, around the 7th season or something, but it didn't feel integrated into the show the way the Prodigy books did, because there were references to things that actually happened on the show. And then it was like, oh, it's kind of serving as a bridge, right, from how they get from point A to point B. So that was really cool. But yeah, I would say, like I said, the processes did feel really different. Like, just with Prodigy, it felt a little bit more like top secret, and I have like access to stuff that other people don't have. I'm reading the scripts and getting to know these characters before other people are getting to know the characters. So that was kind of cool, and it just kind of felt like I was sort of part of something new, as opposed to coming into something that's been around for a long time and then having the weight of all those expectations of what, because people love TNG and like they have this very set ideas of these characters. So I'd say that's kind of the biggest difference. But yeah,
I totally appreciate that as well, because if we think of even obviously Star Trek Picard's 3rd season, which was sort of a big massive reunion for all of these TNG characters, and the internet had its opinions, as it tends to do. But it is, and it's funny, but it's also, there is pressure inherent with, okay, the fact that it's been off the air for so long, that is the story of the next generation. Oh, you're going to add something to the story? Well, I don't know if we can let you away with that. It's like, but isn't it fun to add to the story of that as well? Who's to say that the episodes we got were the only adventures of the Enterprise D?
Right. Well, I think that's kind of the idea with the books, especially the one I wrote, was that it's a bonus adventure. I know they did some books that actually took place after the show ended, that were supposed to kind of extend it, although Picard probably wiped them out in terms of canonicity. But yeah, that's kind of how, honestly, whenever I write time, especially with the Star Trek books, I approach it that way. It's like, this is just a bonus episode, right? Like, there's lots of adventures they're having that we don't see, and this is one of them that you get to find out about.
And I suppose then this leads me to the question of what brought you to Star Trek. Have you been a fan forever and ever? Was it something that you picked up on later on? Or, just being bluntly honest, did you just say, I got to do something different? I've never done Star Trek before. That's it. What's a warp core? Grant, we'll go with that.
I gotta say, I could not imagine doing that. Like never watching an episode of Star Trek and then writing a book set of the universe. No, I've been a Star Trek fan for a long time. TNG was actually like my series. It was on the air when I was a kid, and so I remember watching it when I was really young, and then revisiting it. I think it was in grad school when I was older. I watched the entire series again as an adult, and then that kind of kicked off all my my emergent Star Trek obsession. That was also around the time that the movies were being the Chris Pine movies were being released. So I got all into that. And then I went back and I was watching like the original series, which I had never watched. I started watching Deep Space Nine again. So I kind of got caught back up in the Star Trek world for a long time. And then I got invited to write the TNG book because of my Halo novels. So the editor, my editor with the TNG novels had read my Halo books and enjoyed them. And I was at a Halo convention and he came up, we were at a Halo convention and he was like, hey, would you be interested in writing for Star Trek? And I was like, would I? I would love to write for Star Trek. Because I had, like, when I was in that midst of that obsession, I had read all the old TNG novels. I forgot to mention that were from like the 90s. I had would buy them and, use bookstores and read them. So it was super exciting to kind of be like, wow, I didn't think I would ever get to write a TNG novel because I didn't even think they were still publishing them. So I leapt at the chance. I was super excited. And then when they asked me to write for Prodigy, I was like, of course, like, I'm not going to say no to Star Trek. It doesn't matter what it is. If they ask me to write Star Trek, I will say yes.
It's like, we'd like you to write this new book. It will cost about $150,000 for you to do this, but you get to write a Star Trek book. Well, I'd be a fool not to do this. But then, actually, that's really fascinating. So I'm going to put my hands up straight away. I wouldn't have much knowledge of the Halo universe. So, again, what brings you to Halo? How does that develop? Because, so say if Star Trek amazingly came, the work with Star Trek came from your Halo novels, was Halo then I'm going to go on camp outside and I'm going to make sure they give me this assignment. I've already written the Halo book. I just need them to publish it for me. What was that process?
Yeah, Halo. So Italian novels in general are pretty much invite only. You write your original work and then you kind of prove that you can meet a deadline and you could write a good story. And then that's when the tie-in novels, the tie-in editors are like, hey, would you be interested in writing for this? And so that was another one where they reached out to me because they said they were looking for new voices to write Halo books. And I had just released a science fiction novel that one of the editors had enjoyed. But I was excited about that because I was really into Halo when I was in college. I had even written a paper about it in graduate school. I was in like a media studies class and I wrote a paper about Cortana, who's one of the characters in Halo. So I was like, wow. And I hadn't thought about Halo in years when I was invited to do this. And so I was like, oh, yeah, sure. I'll have to refresh my Halo knowledge. So that was kind of how I came into that. It was another invitation that, again, I was like, yeah, I'm familiar with this universe. I mean, I'm familiar enough with it, or at least the early parts of it, that I feel comfortable that I can go in and write. And I had always enjoyed it. That one's a little weird because the universe is a little odd, a little morally questionable, but you're not allowed to acknowledge that it's morally questionable. Like the way that the Spartans are created is a little sketchy. So that one was kind of fun to like see how far I could push that. And then they're like, no, you can't acknowledge that the government is bad. So it was kind of fun to sort of play around with that a little bit.
That sounds like definitely a challenge, because I presume you want to write these, protagonists that people can get behind and we root behind, but also you're like, it reminds me of I'm not sure if you're familiar with that Mitchell and Webb sketch where they're sitting there in World War II era uniforms, but not the ones you'd want to be wearing.
Right.
And one goes, Hans, are we the baddies?
Yeah, I have seen that many times. Yeah, he was not quite like that, because like the hero, the Spartans, they're fine. It's more like how they came to be is a little, it's like, ooh, I don't know. I feel like the TV show that everybody hated, but I thought was I don't know, everybody hated it. They kind of were like, maybe this, like they'll kind of tease it a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's like, well, the Spartans are supposed to be heroes and they're saving humans from these evil aliens, and that much is pretty black and white. So you just sort of lean into that and be like, let's not talk about the fact that they were war orphans used in a science experiment. I know you said you're not familiar with Halo, but so I feel like I start talking about it, you're like, what are you talking about? Because Halo lore is very complex. There's layers to it. There's lots of different factions, and it gets more and more layered. The more the games were released, the more complicated it got.
That is one thing. It's funny. So in my kind of social group, you have a lot of Trekkies, obviously, and we all we pat ourselves on the back for how much we know about Star Trek. And then, for example, one of the people in the group, huge Warhammer 40k fan, massive fan, and we started talking to him, and we started to realize that we have really specific knowledge about one thing, one property. Yeah, it's like, and then he was telling us all these things. I'm like, oh, how does anyone have the headspace to remember all of these things? And I can imagine, your work in the worlds of Halo and Star Trek. Do you remember how to do things like math? Or, how to drive a car or something? You're just like, hang on, I've got to remember all these things, Spartans and Romulans and
Yeah, well, it's funny because I feel like I forget about it until it comes back up. Like with the Halo stuff, I feel like there was so much I had forgotten. And then I went and I watched some of the cinematics, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that now." And it just starts to come back to you, when I start talking about Halo with people, I'm like, "Oh yeah, well, there's this and there's this, and okay, yeah, now I remember." But I think it kind of gets partitioned away, it's sort of like archived, and then you can go back and retrieve it as needed.
Did you find, obviously all the stories are separate, did you find any kind of themes that might move between the two in terms of your own writing? Like, was there anything that you found, oh, actually that from the Halo world might work in Shadows Have Offended? Or, obviously they came after the Halo books, but I'm going to stop my sentence there. There's the question.
That's a really interesting question. I actually feel like the Halo books and the Prodigy books have a lot in common. Because the Halo books were actually YA novels. And so they're about a group of normal teenagers. It's sort of like the plot of Red Dawn, if you remember that movie. Where
I do, yep.
The Soviets invade small town USA, and the high school football team fights back. It's sort of that, but instead of the Soviets, it's aliens. So you had these sort of group of normal kids who get sucked into this bigger world. And Prodigy is basically the same way, right? You have these kids who don't know anything about Starfleet. They've never even heard of it, and they get sucked into the Star Trek world. It's, so in that way, they were kind of similar. And the difference was that with the Halo books, those were original characters, so I could kind of do whatever I wanted with them. Whereas with Prodigy, they were set, but it's still that same kind of idea of like kids or teenagers learning about a world that the audience is intimately familiar with, and so you're sort of seeing that world through their eyes. So it's a chance to kind of see it in a new way, I guess, which is something that I kind of played around with and explored certainly in the Halo books, but I think that's sort of baked into Prodigy. Like in the show itself, I think that's a big theme in the show of sort of what does Starfleet look like to these people who have never heard of Starfleet but live in the universe. And that's kind of an interesting idea to me. I just thought it was a unique twist in the show itself, that I liked how it did that.
I think so. I remember, if I suppose we go back to the very first announcement of Prodigy, and there was just this plethora of thoughts of, okay, great, we're going to have a new story, new exploration. Okay, they're not Federation. All right, this is fascinating, right? It's a younger audience. And everyone was I think there was a lot of prejudice going into the show, which I think sadly has affected the decisions that have been made since. But hope is not lost. Season 2 will arrive. Not sure in what medium, but it will. And then having watched it, you can see actually I think it's a fascinating peek behind the curtain of both the great Federation and Starfleet, and it's exploring the galaxy, and you've got this pristine ship and hologram Janeway, and you've also got it's relatively easy to infiltrate Starfleet as well, because it's so wonderful and the world is so great and everything. Sure, where would the baddies be? Well, they're wolf in sheep's clothing, as we discover. Possible massive spoilers for Prodigy there, but I'm assuming if you're watching or listening to this, you have seen at least some of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I do remember that announcement, and everybody, I mean, Star Trek in general, I think it gets the internet riled up. And people, like you said earlier, people have very strong opinions about the new versions of Star Trek. And I remember them having very strong opinions about the movies, the new movies, New Trek. I cannot, J.J. Abrams. I remember the drama when those came out. So I think it's sort of inevitable, but I do think because Prodigy was so different from what we've seen from Star Trek before, I think that may have been where some of that reticence was coming from. But I for one found it kind of refreshing. I sort of like seeing new takes on Star Trek, as opposed to sort of trying to repeat the same thing. I think this new wave of Star Trek shows, I like how they're trying to do different genres. If that makes sense. Like, it's all Star Trek, it's all science fiction, space opera kind of stuff. But you have Lower Decks, which makes it into a sitcom, right? Prodigy, which makes it into a kids show, and you have Brave New World, Strange New Worlds, that sort of classic Trek, but still feels modern, like kind of updating the classic Trek format to sort of modern sensibilities and interlocking sort of overarching plot arcs and stuff. And I will admit, I didn't watch all of Discovery, but I'm sure it did cool stuff too. I watched the first season and then kind of dropped off, but that's just something I'm kind of enjoying about the Trek Renaissance we're having.
Trek Renaissance, perfect description. I love it, and even in that description as well, you clearly show there's something for everyone, and if you don't like one, maybe you'll like another one, and that I think is sometimes gets lost in the Twitterverse of discussion. And I'm not saying I'm innocent of that either, just to throw that out there as well. I'm not sitting here with a holier than thou look on everything, but I am holier than that. No, but so. Away from, say, Star Trek and tie-in media, I mean, you have a bloody impressive bibliography. I say that because as a person who's tried to write, I know how difficult it is to finish one project, let alone what you've done. So I know obviously you have your BA in English, you've got your master's in creative writing as well. So presumably you've been just scribbling away for your whole life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably accurate. I was actually really into art, like visual art, when I was a kid. I would sort of write stories and then illustrate them. And I had intended to go into visual arts when I went to college. But I kind of got burned out on it in high school because I took a bunch of art classes and stuff. And so I took creative writing as sort of a like, oh, I'll try something different. And I wound up like, oh, I really do love writing. And I, of course, had written stuff when I was younger too. So that kind of set me on that track of kind of getting an MFA and everything, so originally I was writing like literary fiction, and then kind of branched off into genre fiction and science fiction. And so it just sort of compounded from there. And I write quickly, and I always, like all writers, always have like a billion ideas, more ideas than we'll ever be able to write down. So I just I finished one book and I started another one, and I'm just like, I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it when I'm done. That's kind of my process. So I've definitely been really lucky to kind of have the opportunities and stuff that I've had to write different genres and different age groups, and to write tie-in fiction. So I'm definitely grateful for that.
There's so many stories of, so, when you're doing the first pitch and the first publication of, the sludge pile of, like, your book goes into a queue and it sits there, and obviously you are one of the stories of you got out of that and you got published. What was that initial process like? Because I've been through it. I know others have been through it. It's hard.
Yeah, it is. My experience with that was actually a little different. So like sort of the standard process in traditional publishing is that you submit to agents, or you query agents, and then an agent picks up your book and then they shop it around and hopefully you sell it to a publisher. I actually went backwards. So I had written a novel that I was querying agents and my query was bad. It was bad. Like I read it a few years later and I was like, oh, this sucks. No wonder nobody wanted to like read my novel. But so I wasn't having any luck with agents, but it was actually a British small press called Angry Robot, who they had an open door submission month where they would look at unagented manuscripts. And it was actually their first ever one. They've done it a few times since. And so I submitted to that. And so that was actually how I got my first book deal, because I got selected through that process. And so then once I had the book deal, once you have a book deal, it's super easy to get an agent because then they're like, that's free money, right? You don't have to do any work. So because I had a book deal, I was able to sign with an agent. And so that was sort of how my writing career got started. So I originally published with this small press and then kind of moved on from there to larger presses. And then I still like to work with small presses too. I kind of have done a little bit of everything in terms of, sort of the publishing world. So, but that was like 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And I know the process has changed. Honestly, it seems so much harder now. When I see people on Twitter talking about querying and trying to get a publishing here, I'm just like, gosh, it sounds so hard. And I know when I came in, I would see people who had been around a long time being like, gosh, it seems so much harder now than it did in the 90s. I'm just like, I guess that's just what happens when you've been around. You see the changes and you just can't imagine, like, wow, I can't imagine having to go through that.
I can just imagine, like, because it's funny, as you say, if you go back like an author like Harper Lee sitting there being like, I found it very easy. I don't know why people are complaining these days. I mean, that's easy as but I suppose there is, in a way, I know Amazon has made life a bit easier. Now it's a different, I will stress, is a different route. That's the self-publishing route, which is of course as valid, but again, to all aspiring writers going down there, it's different. Be aware of that and make sure you're good at marketing.
Yeah, it's a lot more work. So it's how it seems to be. Yeah.
Which in a way is funny. I mean, I guess as well, that's why it's as difficult to get in with a publisher, is because a publisher, they don't just go write your books out there, because it's on them as well. They need to recoup whatever investments they put in. So they will then market, and that's why it's hard to get in with them, because they can't take in 7,000 books a week.
Yeah. Yeah. When I've also heard that as it's gotten easier to physically type up a manuscript, the amount of people writing books has obviously gone up. So when you had to write it on a typewriter, that's a lot more effort than writing it in a word processor that you can email, right? If you write it on a word processor, but you still have to print it off, which, like, when I was coming into writing or coming into publishing, that shift was just starting to happen, where you could submit digitally versus, because like I was printing off short stories and I was printing off 30 copies of a short story and mailing it, which is a lot more work than just shooting off 30 emails, right? So I feel like that may have contributed in some way, where you've always had people who wanted to write, but it's just physically easier now. And so they have the opportunity to tell their story. But I think as that has happened, like you said, with self-publishing and Amazon, the ways you can publish something have also sort of opened up. So it kind of keeps it level, but it just everything changes. And so when you've been around a long time, you're like, oh, change. It's terrifying.
It's like, kind of like, change is good, change is possible, but also slow down.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you find, because obviously you teach as well, do you find that the changing methods and the changing outputs, does that affect what and how your style of teaching goes across? Or do you find that the way that you teach, is it more toward the composition and sort of everything else comes later?
Yeah, I mean, I mostly teach craft classes, and I don't think that stuff changes a whole lot. Maybe if you're getting really into the self-publishing world is so different than traditional publishing, even at a craft level. There's a lot more emphasis on writing to market and kind of that sort of thing. But just like basic craft stuff isn't going to change, like characterization and dialogue and telling a complete story. Understanding your genre, all that stuff is pretty much the same. So I would say with that kind of stuff, it hasn't really changed it. But any kind of talk about publishing, and in writing classes, students always want to know about publishing. I can teach, I'll teach a class, writing about, maybe not the erotica classes, but like writing science fiction, fantasy. I'm always going to have people who have questions about publishing. And that's where I have to kind of say, hey, look, I can tell you what I did, but that was 10 years ago and things are a lot different now. So I kind of always give that caveat, and then always kind of, but some stuff is also the same. It's like, yes, with self-publishing, you have to invest some money up front, but you own everything. So that doesn't mean you should pay a publisher to publish your book. Like that has always been, never pay for a publisher. A publisher pays you. Self-publishing hasn't actually changed that. So I think there's still some things that are universal, but I also just try to be mindful of the fact that like my sort of a debut experience is going to be a lot different than what debuts now are experiencing, and just kind of trying to acknowledge that. And like, you can talk to people who are who published their first book a little more recently or been through the query rounds a little more recently, and they'll probably give you better advice than I can. My advice basically boils down to, it sucks. Don't give up. Like, it sucks. It takes a long time. If you don't give up, like that's pretty universal advice, but like the nitty gritty details are going to change.
That's actually, and you're so right. The universal advice element of that, you're so right. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is, the one where, oh, writing's easy. You sit down at a typewriter and bleed. And I love that one because and then you're thinking like, how do we sales pitch this? How do we get new writers? And it's because we are crazy.
Yeah.
Like it's as simple as that. Why does somebody write? Why does a bird fly? Because they have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think people like I've always known that like if I didn't have a publishing deal, if I wasn't being published, I would still write. I might write fan fiction or something, I might write some kind of web novel and just throw it on there and see what happens. But I would still be writing stories and putting them out somehow. When I was a kid or a teenager, I used to write zines, like actual photocopied zines. Now people say zines and it's like a literal book. I'm like, that's not really a zine. Actual like zines where I would go and photocopy them at the library and staple them myself. So I think there have always been people who want to write and who want to tell stories, and they do that, and maybe they don't show anybody, or they find unique ways to get it out, out in the world. However, whatever, if publishing doesn't work, they'll try writing a zine, making a zine. This was like 20 years ago. Now we have the internet for that, right? I think that's part of like that, maybe why social media is so popular, because especially something like Twitter, that's text-based, people want to write and express themselves, and this is a way for them to do it. Even if they would never write a novel, it's still writing. So that's sort of my like half-baked theory on it anyway.
I like it because you're right, and the idea of blogs as well. Rest in peace, Tumblr.
I still use Tumblr. I don't care.
I love that. It's just because it was so big and then it seemed to vanish, but it's still there. I do remember myself some very emo posts from I'd love to say my teen years, from my 20s. Just like, I've got to be honest, but what I want to ask you as well about is, it's a genre that I feel is very overlooked, and that is erotica, because I think it's very difficult to write that and to have it seen as something that I put equal amounts of effort and equal amounts of care into this. And there will be some reviews like, oh, but it's just erotica. I'm like, no, it's still hard. How have you? Well, first of all, how have you found the composition style as opposed to, say, fantasy or sci-fi, and then the reaction?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I agree. First of all, I definitely agree. I think that erotica takes just as much effort. It's not easy to write. In some ways, it's harder, especially if you're not doing particularly kinky erotica, because there's only so many ways to describe what's happening in a way that is both interesting and then also arousing. I mean, that's part of why people read erotica, is that it has to trigger a physical response. So it has like really unique challenges to it. And And a lot of people who write erotica, especially like who are publishing it on Amazon and stuff, they're writing it fast. They're doing like a story a week, which is really easy to burn out. Again, because you're having to find new ways to basically tell the same story over and over again. So it has some of those unique challenges. I've definitely read some very artistic erotica or very literary erotica that I think is actually like it's literature. It's really beautiful, while also kind of meeting the requirements of erotica, sort of baseline requirements of being, sexy or whatever. But so I think that, in terms of it's similar to any other kind of writing, but it does have some unique qualities. Mostly like you're trying to kind of elicit that. I mean, every piece of writing is trying to elicit an emotional response, but erotica is trying to elicit that physical response, which can be kind of challenging. And everybody's different, and what one person likes, another person won't like. And so you have a lot of things you have to kind of think about. And like word choice is really important in erotica. Like how raunchy do you want to get? How would the character actually say this stuff versus how would I say it, or how would somebody who's like trying to write sexy erotica say it? So there's a lot of it's almost like, this is gonna sound crazy, it's almost like poetry in that way, and thinking about voice and point of view. In terms of how people react, a lot of people think it's kind of cool. I'm sure. I mean, I've run in social circles where people like they tend to be writers, and they're like, oh yeah, that's fun. So I don't have a lot of like people who are shocked by it or disturbed by it or whatever. So I have actually, I'm like, I'll tell people, I don't care. I can see if you are in more conservative spaces, there may be, a need to kind of keep it a secret or whatever. But I think people are a little more open to it than we might think. And I also think most writers have probably dabbled in it in some way. Even if they say they haven't, they may not admit it. Maybe they've written erotic fan fiction that they'll never tell you about, right? Maybe they've written like just some sexy stories for themselves or for a partner that they don't want to tell you about, which is totally fine. But I do think writers kind of will always sort of dabble in it a little bit, and just to try it out, even if they're not going to publish it or show it to anybody.
Because to pick up on actually something you said, which I think is a perfect description, in that it's like poetry, in that in setting, I suppose this is universal, but in setting any scene, the wrong word in the wrong place just can completely take you out of the moment. Which I think would be such a form of poetry as well. If you are, I'm very much not a poet, so I'm going to try and come up with an example. Like, say, if you're describing a flower, and I don't know, you use the words bleach. I don't know. Right. I'm not a poet. I'm not a poet. But yeah, you say something and it just completely shatters the mood straight away. Mm-hmm. You then have the massive problem of, right, well, then everything you said that you have to try and get back to that again. So how much constant rewriting is going on? And of course, that's not to suggest that that doesn't go on in every genre. I just feel like, would it be fair to say that erotica is quite a stylized type of?
I think so. And so like what you were talking about, if I may get a little English teachery here, it really teaches you about connotation and denotation, right? So there's the dictionary definition of words, but then certain words have connotations to the audience. And so in erotica, especially, you really have to think about the connotations of those words, especially when you're talking about body parts. So like some body part words feel clinical, some feel like sort of sexist, and so, but some people like that, and so some feel sexy and others don't feel sexy, and so you have to really think about those connotations. That's sort of what you were talking about, with like choosing the right words to set the stage. So yeah, I definitely think that's true. And now I forgot what your actual question was. I'm so sorry.
It's in fairness, it was a meandering question anyway, so it's fine. But I think you've really you've answered it there. It's that, being aware of, in a line of 10 words, that one word that just breaks the rhythm, breaks the mood. And actually, that's a fantastic example of using clinical names are often just mood shatterers.
Right. Yeah. Nobody wants to read that in there. Nobody wants to read the medical terms for body parts or whatever in their erotica. They want the sexy words. So yeah, that's just something. I mean, yeah, it's just, so the process is different. The other thing, I remember the other thing I was going to say that I think was getting at your question about it being stylized. That's what it was. Is that plots are a lot different in erotica. You can kind of throw plausibility to the wind in a way that you can't do in other genres, because the focus is different, which that's kind of freeing in a way.
Then of course, now what I really want to see is I want to see your take on Trek erotica. I'm going to say this right now, possibly not Prodigy. No. we might leave those two things completely separate, but TNG, which I mean, God knows, you only need to look at the first season of TNG. I'd say could probably be classed as erotica, a lot of it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Star Trek erotica has a long storied history. You can find that easy. I mean, that was part of, I feel like a lot of people don't want to acknowledge it, but that was part of what saved it. The original series in the 60s was the fandom, the sort of zine fan fiction fandom that was built around it. Kirk Spock is legendary, of course. And there was even a tie-in novel in the 80s. Oh, I don't remember what it was called, that got really, really close to being full-on Kirk Spock / fiction. It wasn't erotica, but it got really close to showing them in a relationship. Like it got right up to the line and then pulled back. And it's a classic, and I cannot remember. I'm sure your listeners are like screaming, like
someone's probably shouting it. Yeah.
Because it's very well known. So yeah, I was like, if you want Star Trek erotica, you can find it very, very easily with a quick internet search. But I mean, I think that's part of part of the history of its fandom, that I think is really cool. I
think you're right as well.
Like Ryza and stuff, they hint at it's a syndicated show. They can't show much, but they hint at it. Like, obviously the Star Trek future, I think, is meant to be a lot more open than our world. So they show as much as they can.
That is true. There was actually, as of the recording of this, so the Las Vegas convention is just wrapped, and seeing some of the cosplays, I saw a good friend of mine, Brad, went as that season 1 Riker, where he's in the kind of the draped material and the chest is on full show. Yeah, and I thought, that is brilliant, because I know exactly where it's from, and I don't know what that says about me, but I know exactly where it's from, and it was just brilliant.
Yeah. It's funny when you said he went as Riker. I knew exactly. I think that I pictured it immediately. Like I knew exactly what you were going to say.
The 80s. But it is, and actually, of course, you use the example of Kirk Spock. I mean, the term /fiction originated with Kirk and Spock,
right? Yeah,
which I blew my mind when I learned that, because I'd known the term /fiction long before I knew the connection. I think we're going back to 1967. I think we're going back to then, when the first Spirk story was out there, because there is romance to be found everywhere. And then there's Gene Roddenberry's novelization of the motion picture, and there's romance to be found everywhere. Then that's what I'll say. Do you find then that you have published erotica, you've published fan fiction, you've published tie-in fiction, of course you've published your original work as well. So tell us a little bit about your original work and what that has inspired. Because I won't ask the question. Every writer gets asked the question, why do you write? Where do your ideas come from? And if we knew that, we would market it. So what does that inspire in your continued writing?
Oh, I like the way you phrased that. So I mean, my original fiction is sort of all over the place. I mean, it all sort of falls under the science fiction, fantasy, like speculative umbrella, but I've done all kinds of different things. So I've done like epic fantasy, I've done adventure fantasy, I've done science fiction, like near future science fiction, far future science fiction, space opera. I've written for adults. I've written for teenagers, right? I've done romance. I've done non-romance. Like I just kind of am all over the place. And I think something, everything I write, it's sort of, I feel like there's certain like sort of things I like to play around with. I really like to play around with genre and like, okay, I'm going to write a space opera story, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit and make it a little bit different, make it a little, sort of strange. And then I'll do the same thing with fantasy. And I feel like every time I write something new, I'm like, okay, I've done that. Now I'm going to try my hand at something else. So I feel like a lot of times with the original fiction, a lot of it is sort of like trying new things and seeing what it's like to write in different genres or to write different types of stories. And so that when I've kind of written that type of story, I'm like, okay, cool. I know what that's like. So now I want to try something else. So maybe I want to try horror next, or I want to write like a long series because I've actually never written a long series. Most of my books are standalones, or they're like kind of duology kind of things. There's a few that are duologies. They have a sequel, but I've never done like a big long series. So maybe that's something I want to try next. So that's sort of how I think I would answer the question, what does it inspire? Is it's like, I'm trying different things because as a reader, I read sort of across the board. I think a lot of writers are like that. And so I always want to try different stuff. I get in a horror kick. And so that makes me want to write horror. And then I'm like, oh, what about Westerns? Do people still write Westerns? Can I write a Western? Like, it's just, that's kind of what I like how I kind of approach my original fiction.
I like that as well. And I love that idea. It's like, do people still write Westerns? Because if, there is an audience for everything. Absolutely everything. Like, I'm sure there's probably somebody listening or watching this right now is like, I like Westerns.
Yeah.
And that's the fun of it. So, because also then you've actually sort of preemptively answered our next question is, do you work more in standalone? Do you work more in series? So it kind of sounds like standalone, but maybe series on the way.
Yeah, I definitely like. I want to experiment with series. It's always intimidated me, because I hate this term. I'm a pantser or a discovery writer, right? I kind of write I sort of write. I don't have a plan, basically. And I always feel like with a series, you have to have a plan to some degree. Like you have to kind of know where you're going. You can't just wing it. I think that's why Game of Thrones is not finished, or Song of Ice and Fire.
The first thought that went into my head as you said it. Yeah.
I think that's why it will never be finished. So I've been forced to learn to outline. When I first started writing, I never outlined. I refused to use an outline. I might type some notes to myself and that was it. But like with the tie-in fiction, especially, you have to write to outline. You have to have an outline approved before they'll let you do it, because you can't just like write a whole manuscript of like basically fan fiction stuff that they're like, yeah, we can't publish this. So you have to get your outlines approved. So that got me used to writing to outline. So I feel a little more comfortable with it. So that is something I'm kind of wanting to do in the future, is maybe write a longer series. And maybe I'll try to do it. Publishers are kind of pulling away from series, so maybe I'll use it as an excuse to experiment with self-publishing a little bit more and sort of see where that takes me. So that's, I guess I'm kind of view writing as learning in a way, and sort of trying different stuff out and seeing what happens.
I love that idea. Like, this idea of writing is learning, because the nature of writing is you're going to spend a lot of time on this one story. Now, even if the story is sprawling and huge and everything, you're still going to spend so much time in there. And let's say there's a character who's a fireman.
Right.
Grant, I'm going to learn all about the trade of firefighting, or trade. Yeah, it is a trade, I guess. Vocation. Yeah, there we go. But what's a fancy word for bloody hard work? Writing. Yeah. And I think, like when you spend that long on something, I can understand kind of by the end of the project being an expert. Now, the next day it could be right, blank slate, so every writer's an expert in something for at least 24 hours in their life.
I think that's true. I also hear people talk about, and I think this is true too, that you learn to write every book as you write it. Like every book, no book is written the same way. So a process that worked for writing one book won't work for the next book. So you're learning about the subjects of the books and all this stuff. And then you're also just like learning how to write again. Like that process is always changing too.
Cassandra, you have been so generous with your time, so thank you so much. I'm going to come up toward the end now. I've a big question to ask now in a sec, but before we get to there, can I just ask, what is next for you, for the fans who want to know what's coming? What is, or what can you talk about, or if you have anything that maybe that is like NDA'd or anything, you can tell us. We promise we won't tell.
Yeah, I'm in that process where I can't really talk about what I've got next, kind of coming up next. I have some original work that's with my agent that will hopefully be kind of finalized and go out. That's a sort of science fiction horror-y kind of thing. And then, like I said, I'm also playing around with writing a series. So that's kind of where I'm at now. Nothing firmed up, but stuff is in the pipeline.
That is great. That I know that will be enough for some people to be like, yes. Right. Okay. So lovely, easy question for you. We ask it of all of our guests. No thought required. Nice and simple. Cassandra Clarke, what does Star Trek mean to you?
Oh, wow. So to me, you lied. That is not an easy question. Star Trek to me, I find Star Trek very comforting. Like TNG is my comfort show. If I'm stressed or having a bad day, I know I've got some free streaming thing that literally just shows Star Trek 24/7. So I know I can just go put that on and it'll just show me Star Trek episodes and I will feel comforted. Like, especially with TNG, I don't know if it's because I watched it when I was a kid. Like, I don't even mean the episodes. I just like the sounds. The show has a sound, like the sound of the Enterprise is super calming. The kind of dramatic horn music when they fade to black for the commercial, like it's just very comforting to me. And I think, like I said, some of that is because I associate with my childhood and all of that, but I also think it provides like a sort of, because it provides such a hopeful future, especially those classic episodes, the Star Trek and the original series and TNG. When the world is crazy and it feels like, it's like, oh my gosh, the oceans are boiling, right? You can kind of remember in Star Trek, like the Star Trek history is that humanity went through this really dark period and was able to emerge on the other side. And I think that's what's so comforting about Star Trek to me, is just that sort of promise of a hopeful future. And that even as the show is, I don't know how long ago the 60s were. I can't do math, whatever, 60 years ago.
A while ago.
Right? Like even over the course of 60 years, our society has changed, but Star Trek has always altered itself to adapt to our society while maintaining that sort of core message of hope. Even if it might look different from how it did in the original series, it's still there. And I think that is kind of what Star Trek means to me, is like sort of hope and comfort that like things are going to be okay. Even if it doesn't seem like it right now.
I love that. Because I couldn't agree with you more. Star Trek is an idea of hope, and it's one that we need. And I don't know, call me naive, but I think we'll get there.
Yeah. Well, that's, like I said, that's what I love about it, is that it's not like it was this clear trajectory from 1965 to Star Trek world, right? Like it allowed humanity to kind of go to the depths and then rise back up. And I think that to me, that is what is so great about Star Trek, is that it wasn't just, we landed on the moon and now Star Trek universe, like we actually had to fight to get there. And I think that's what's so reassuring about it.
Cassandra, I want to thank you so much for coming on and having a chat with me. You are an absolute superstar. It is so appreciated. To everyone who's been watching and listening along, thank you so much. You are wonderful. We will, of course, be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I am Seán Ferrick. You can find us on our socials at Clone Star Pod on Twitter, Instagram. I think we're on all of them. Cassandra, where will people reach out to get in touch with yourself?
Probably the best place is to just go to my website, Cassandra Rose Clarke, and that is Clarke with an E at the end. Sometimes I think it's probably easier to just plug it into Google. I am not on social media as much these days, although if you reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram, or Tumblr, because I am still on Tumblr, I will definitely respond. I just don't post on there as much, but I monitor them and am around. So yeah.
Excellent. Right. Well, we will put those links in the description of this episode so people can go straight and see everything to do with you. Everyone, thank you so much. You are awesome. Live long and prosper.